This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this quarter's Young Member Committee webinar. The session topic is Professional Responsibility and Ethics in the 21st Century Learned Professional. This session will introduce or reacquaint us, the practicing professionals, with the foundation and principles that guide most code ethics for the learned professionals in the United States. The discussion is geared towards engineering, but the concepts discussed today are equally applicable to anyone who performs their duties with clients, stakeholders, or partners, and especially the public, where personal trust is essential for the performance of our work. We're honored to have today's speaker, Dr. Joe Mannis, PE and Board of Certified Water Resource Engineers at the American Academy of Water Resource Engineers. Dr. Joe is the current director of the Institute of Water Resources with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers located in Alexandria, Virginia. Dr. Joe Mannis oversees a multidisciplined field operating agency that supports USA's civil works and water resource missions through water resource planning, policy, decision support, model development, hydraulic and hydrological engineering, dam and levee safety, training, national and international interface with academia, professional societies, and non-government organizations. Dr. Mannis is a graduate from the Georgia Institute of Technology and Civil Engineering, North Georgia College of Physics, University of Illinois, a Master's in Science and Civil Engineering, and the U.S. Army War College, Master's of Strategic Studies, as well as the University of Minnesota, where he received his PhD in Environmental Engineering. Prior to becoming the director at IWR, Joe served as the Water Resource Engineer and Manager for the international activities with IWR, where he specialized in areas of water resources, environmental security issues that were associated with water. He worked closely with the Office of the Assistant Secretary to the Army for Civil Works and Headquarters, USACE. Dr. Mannis is a retired U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officer, with his last active duty assignment being an Academy professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he taught several courses in environmental engineering, water resources, and environmental security. Currently, Dr. Mannis is an adjunct professor at George Mason University, teaching courses in engineering, economics, and water resources. With that, Dr. Joe, I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank everybody for joining us around your lunch hour. I don't know what part of the country you're joining us from, so good morning or good afternoon or good noontime. It's interesting that you're willing to join us for a discussion of ethics. Some of you may be joining us to meet your requirements for your PE. Many states, as you well know, require PDHs and engineering ethics to fulfill your annual requirement for your PE licensure. I've been involved with the topic of engineering ethics, and as the title says, professional responsibility, for most of my career, because I found that, and as we'll discuss as we go through the presentation, the idea of separating what we do as learned professionals is more than just ethics. It's really about what we want to do and what we're enabled to do. And our profession understands that. I think it's something that we don't really talk about in academia, certainly as we go through our formal education. And it surprisingly doesn't come up as much as it should in practice. But it certainly underlies our ability to do much of what we do. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. Why does it and why should it be part of what we discuss and part of what we practice? So let's go to slide 2, if you could, please. And we have an agenda, and I'll talk a little bit about the topics that are coming up. So I'm going to go through some philosophical perspectives, a little bit about why it is that we're going to cover these topics. And there is a foundation, believe it or not, for why these ideas exist. And then some practical implications, because we are engineers. It's not all about philosophy. The rules and statutes that exist for how these ideas are put into practice and then we'll get into some examples. Slide 3, please. So, starting off with, I have to say that there is nothing more boring than a presentation about ethics. I've been into all kinds of discussions. I've been the chair of the National Institute of Engineering Ethics. I've sat on some National Academy discussion panels that talk about ethics and the philosophy of doing good things, and those things are just incredibly boring. They definitely will put you to sleep. And that's not my goal. My goal is to help frame this, but we're going to have to talk about some principles and some ideas for why we do this. Otherwise, it's just rambling. So we'll put a couple of ideas in front of you and see where it takes us. Now, the first one is this idea of utilitarianism. This one ought to promote the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. I mean, you've heard of this before. Now, normally in an audience, and we have some give and take, I'll ask some people where you've heard this before. And where have you heard it? Well, you heard it on Star Trek, right? That's what Mr. Spock used to say. I'm losing the quote. The greatest amount of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? And that was Spock always said. Well, that's basically John Stuart Mill, going back to the 19th century. But the idea of utilitarianism is that you're trying to do the most for the most good for the most people. But it also gets into a kind of a hedonism sort of a view if you take it to the extreme. That good is associated with pleasure or bad with pain. And that's a hedonistic view. But whether an action is right or wrong depends on the consequence. Again, that's taking it to the extreme. And you've heard this before, I'm sure, that, well, if it turns out okay, then it must be okay. And I'm not sure that I would subscribe to that in every case. I mean, if it turns out all right, then it's okay. I mean, if you turn through an intersection on a red light and you get away with it, then that must make it was all right. That's not really what we're intending here. But that's what utilitarianism is trying to say, is that we're trying to do the greatest amount of good by what we're trying to achieve by our actions. But if you do it in moderation, that's what John Stuart Mill was trying to say. And you're trying to maximize, which is something an engineer can associate with, maximization of greatest efficiency. Slide 4, please. Virtuous ethics. This gets down to the idea of what an individual can do and what they believe in. So Aristotle, we're really going back in time now, aren't we? This idea of happiness is in accordance with the perfect virtue. That means that you're just trying to live a good life. So actions are consistent in the way you live your life. You're just trying to be a good person. So this idea of a correct attitude, and so virtue ethics is the idea that you are trying to be a good person, where utilitarianism was you're just trying to maximize good. You don't always have to be a good person to do that. You know, the outcomes will judge well how good you were. You mean you can roll with the pigs, so to speak. You just get dirty, but if the good was turned out all right, that was okay. Whereas Aristotle was saying you just try to live a good life, and that's the virtue that comes out of it is because you are inherently trying to be good. But two different ways of looking at ethical views, and this is what compounds the issue of what is ethics all about, because there's different ways of looking at it, and hence why we're discussing these ideas. So let's look at slide 5, please. The ethic of reciprocity. All of you have heard this. The other way of explaining it is called in Christian views is the golden rule. Immanuel Kant back in the 18th century I don't know, got somebody's spreadsheet up. His view was man is not a thing and hence something to use merely as a means. You know, it means that you don't just use people. That you're trying to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the more common way, and in our American sort of language, at least for most of us. But it's about how you treat others. It's about respect. So now we're thinking about three things: the greater good that comes out of things, about living your life because it's the right thing to do, and now we're talking about respect for others. All three grounded in some very fundamental viewpoints. Any one of them taken to an extreme can be taken out of context, could be abhorrent in and of itself. But we're trying to look for a middle ground. So let's look at the next slide, please. Then there's the idea of intuition, that idea of gut feel. And we hear these I want to say I've lost my word here, but I'll just go what's on the screen. We talk about women's intuition. Your mom had the idea that she knew what was right because she could sense what was going on in you. She just knew what was going on because of the way you behaved. There's the gambler's intuition, that they knew what was going to be a sure thing, even if they didn't. There's also the idea of a spiritual. That one's harder to pin down. Brings up a lot of in the contemporary writings of today, whether a lot of people not sure they believe in it, but certainly it goes to the real heart of what is something that's spiritual. By definition, faith is believing in something that can't be proven. So it must be by intuition, because it can't be proven. You believe in something, whether it's a deity or a belief in other people to do certain things, but it can't be proven. And so all three of these, whether you by convention or by mythology or by religious convention, you have this gut feel that something is true and something is going to happen. But we call it intuition in a more general sense, that something is going to occur or will happen or will behave in a certain way. So we end up with this idea of a moral conscience. And in that conscience, it can shape our behavior. And some examples that get into the ethical view are these two items listed are printed in green. For some of you may be familiar with something called the Pinto fuel tank case study. In the 1970s, the Pinto, some of you may remember, a really ugly car that was Ford produced. And after it was fielded, it turned out that it had a flaw in the gas tank that was in the back of it. And they found out that if it was rear-ended, it had a high propensity to explode and to burst into fire. And quite a number of them actually did catch fire and burn up. And Ford Motor Company, some of their people, not necessarily at the very top, but at a certain level, did a cost-benefit analysis and determined that it was more economically advantageous to pay off the losses when people died than it was to go back and recall all of those Pintos and do the repair. And they didn't publicize this, of course, but eventually the word got out that they had done this cost benefit, and it was a public relations nightmare for Ford Motor Company. But why didn't they publicly announce it, that they had done the cost benefit analysis that was cheaper to pay off the deaths than it was to go recall the cars? They must have known that that was not an acceptable thing to do. It wasn't about just paying off damages to cars. It was about paying off deaths to people. They knew there was a moral issue there, and they hid it. The same thing's true when you talk about genocide. If we think about the Holocaust during the Second World War, or the genocide that occurred in Rwanda, or in Cambodia, or in Serbia. These were atrocities that people didn't publicize. They actually went to great lengths to cover up exactly what happened. Why didn't they publicly announce that these were the things that were going on? It's because somehow the people that were involved were aware that there was something wrong about it. There was a moral recognition that there was something wrong. And so there must have been a moral conscience at work. And why is that? Well, there must have been something inherent in the moral character that was there. And we could think of other things that people recognize as being inherent. Hard to define exactly what things are inherent, but there is something that is inherent in the human character that is recognizable, though sometimes hard to exactly define. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we get to the engineering profession. And when we're thinking about the engineering profession, there are three areas of responsibility that we are accountable to. And they're on your screen. Normally, I don't put these up when I have an audience. I poll the audience and have them guess, and we go through an interactive discussion about what each of these are. The first one, the employer and the client, is usually the one everybody picks up right away. And those are easy, right? They pay your salary. You're working for your employer, you're designing or you're constructing something for a client, and it's easy to see that you have a responsibility to design something for them that will perform in the way that they want, that will be safe and will be resilient and meet the needs that they are paying you to do. The one that's the next one that comes up is usually the society. And people are familiar with Canon 1 of the American Society of Civil Engineers, or NSPE, the National Society of Professional Engineers, which is to hold paramount the public, the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So we can see that there's this safety component to the public. So we can see that the society could be a responsibility that we have a ethical responsibility to protect. The one that usually is a little more difficult to pick up on is the third one there, C, the profession, the other licensees. And so why is it? Why do we have a challenge then for the profession? Okay, at this point, I think I'm going to ask our moderator there to unmute the telephone lines, and hopefully not everybody's sitting by in an airport or somewhere and got all the sound going. And I'm going to see who has some ideas that they might want to ponder out there as to why we have a responsibility to the profession, an ethical responsibility to the profession.
Lines are open.
Are we unmuted? Got 22 people online.
Yes, lines are open.
Okay.
This is Michelle with Lutron. So I think the reason why the profession is important is because you're representing yourself as an engineer or somebody in your industry. So if you're not ethically correct, you're also doing a damage to everybody else that has a similar title and a similar profession. So we all need to be held to this high standard.
Okay. That's a good answer. I think there's a little bit more to it, but that's a good answer. Somebody else have something they would like to offer?
Hi, this is Lily Cartwright with Trevette. I would say it's our responsibility to act ethically, not just for those in our same career path, but also because ultimately what we're doing as engineers is designing a society that can encourage and ensure trust among the systems we're working in, among the people we're working around and through, whether it's the client, the employer, your peer. And so by sticking to a personal and societal code of ethics, we're ensuring that trust is in not only each other, but also the structure in which we're living.
Okay, you're getting closer. That's very good. That's very good. Getting closer. There's still a little bit more to it. Somebody else? Don't be shy. Come on. Okay. Let's think about this for a second. We are engineers or scientists or learned professionals. I'll put it in that category. And what distinguishes people in that area, in that field, these fields, is that we are working on challenging problems. Let's say you're a geotechnical engineer and you're working on the foundation. Typically on a geotechnical engineer, about 3% of the design cost goes into the geotechnical investigation. That's kind of a rough rule of thumb, right? So you go out there and you explore the foundation and you get some idea what the subsurface looks like. Do you know exactly every aspect of what the foundation or the subsurface looks like? Not really. You have a pretty good idea. But you're going to make some assumptions about the information that you don't have. And even if you're a structural engineer and you specify 60 KSI steel for the building, you have to make some assumptions that the way it's going to be put together is going to be put together exactly the way you designed it. And the connections are all going to go in a certain way. So you are working with imperfect information about all aspects of everything that's going to go together. Unlike if you were an electrician who works with very specific information about how to put the electrical wiring inside the building. Because when you go inside the building, you're told exactly what size wire to put in, 12 gauge Romax, or it's going to go in a certain kind of cable, right? And you're going to use switches or duplex outlets or a certain size breaker box, and you're going to be told exactly how that's going to be put together. You're going to have a code that's going to give you all the details that's going to be put in. You make no assumptions about anything that you're going to do when you install everything from the grounding rod that goes into the ground to where the electrical power is connected to the grid. Everything is specified for you. Same thing's true if you're a plumber. But if you're the designer of the building, you're going to make a lot of assumptions about what the loads are that are going to be placed on the exterior of the building, about how the building is going to be used, and about how the building will be constructed. In essence, you're going to work with imperfect information. And that is the domain of the learned professional, that you're going to work with imperfect information. You're going to make assumptions about how that's going to be built. And then you're going to create a design, and you're going to have that design built, and it's going to stand. And you're going to use something called engineering judgment to make that design work. And the public then is going to allow you to use that judgment in place of specified information. And that is something that your license as a professional engineer is empowering you to do. Now, I've talked with people, seasoned engineers, and whenever I give this talk, I'll say, well, what entitles you to be able to go out there and build that building or design that building? And they'll say, well, my 30 years of experience in the field. And the answer to that is, no, that's not true. That doesn't entitle you to do that. The public that allows you to go and practice your trade entitles you to do that. They can take away that privilege to do that design at any time they choose. Or they can make the constraints on your ability to do that. They can provide greater oversight of the decisions you make at any time. And they actually have done that over the years, provide greater oversight of what you do. And if they choose to do that, they will. So this whole idea here of the area of responsibility to the profession is all about making sure that the public trusts us enough that we are responsible enough, trustworthy enough to be allowed to make engineering judgment in our practice. Because when they take away the trust, then they take away our ability to do our job and make engineering judgment. And even within my career, the level of judgment that we're allowed to make has diminished because people have abused that ability to make those judgments, and we have greater oversight than we once did. So the things that were mentioned before are all true because they all lead into this idea of responsibility. And we have a responsibility to our profession to be trustworthy and to be a trustworthy profession. And when we get into some examples in a little bit, looking at the code of ethics that each of the states put out, whether they won't be codes of ethics, they'll be statutes that talk about the profession. You're going to see things that will, like some of them will say, we're not supposed to advertise competitively because we're not supposed to be marketing our skills on a least cost basis. We're supposed to be marketing our skills on the worthiness of our skills basis. We're supposed to not be running down the ability of others in our profession. We're supposed to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And that brings into some interesting questions about if can we hold ourselves to a different standard of behavior outside of work than we do inside work. All right. So, for example, can we have moral turpitude in our personal life and act very conservatively and very responsibly at work, and think that those two have no relationship on each other? I want to ask you guys, what do you think? Is it fair that those two should not cross each other? I don't know if the mics are on or not, but do you think it's fair for the public to expect that of us?
Lines are still open. Yes.
Yeah. What do you think? You think it's fair that the public might expect that of us? Too bad I can't look at you. Usually when I look at the audience, I can stare at somebody long enough until they answer. I can't do that over the phone.
Hey, this is Zachary Payne from Matrix Design Group. I certainly feel that it's fair that there's an expectation there, that there's this level of trust that society places in us for this, our job and our discipline. So it's important that we live up to that higher expectation.
Yeah. I think it. No, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Taking it out of the AEC world, I mean, we certainly expect that from our medical professionals and the doctors that we're seeing. So
yeah.
if we're expecting of other licensed professionals, then I mean that ownership's on us for fulfilling our role.
Yeah, there's actually a commercial out now, right? Where the doctor comes in and says he just got his license back, and or the patient says, "You feeling okay today?" And he says, "Yeah, I feel all right," or something like that. Y'all seen that commercial? Yeah, it's kind of a weird one. But we may say, I don't want that. I don't want to associate my personal life with my professional life. But what I find is that the public has their own way of looking at what they want to choose to associate. They sometimes don't leave it up to us to disassociate the two things. And that's now the bigger the firm is, probably the less chance of associating the two. But certainly in smaller firms and smaller towns, they become quite linked. It's an interesting way of looking at what we do, and but it's a true thing, and that's why when you look at these three things, now where do you see these? Actually, if you look at the fundamentals of engineering exam, I think a lot of you are familiar with that. First step toward, well, after you get your degree, you take that exam and then you go on to get your PE license. These are the three ways that the NCEES approaches the engineering ethics portion of the fundamental engineering exam. And this is also a way some of the states approach the engineering ethics portion of whatever it is they include in their statutes, as they look at it, these three components for the ethics portion of whatever it is they include. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here's some things that I borrowed. I got the reference down below. Whenever there's a question that I come up with, I'll come across, and I'm sitting there debating how I'm going to deal with it, I say, well, what should I do in this situation? I have these tests that I can consider, and I have about 3 of these that I use. But you can just read through them. You can easily apply them however you think. You can see the harms test and the reversible test. You get it. I don't need to read through that. The colleague test is a pretty good one. Go ask somebody. Lots of times we say, I don't want to ask anybody. I'm afraid of what they'll say. But, well, if they're afraid of what they're going to say, you probably a good idea right there that, something you need to maybe bring up to somebody. But the colleague test is a pretty good one. Legal test, if it's illegal, it probably is got an ethical issue there. So take it to your office counsel and see what they have to say about it. Publicity test is probably my number 2 one that I use. So for me, if I don't want to see this on the front page of the Washington Post, I probably don't need to be doing it. That's the one that I use when I talk to other people. I say, do we want to see this on the front page of the Washington Post? And if we don't want to see it on the front page, then what we need to be doing to change it so that it would be okay? It's a pretty simple question. Is it common practice? Is everybody doing this? Or are we the only ones doing this? Then why are we the only ones doing it? What's everybody else doing to solve this problem? There's got to be a better solution than if we're the only ones trying to do this. Next slide. My number 1 is the first one on this slide, the wise relative. I asked my grandmother. So if I can't explain to my grandmother, 1, it must be too complicated. I need to figure out a better way to approach it. And second, if I'm too embarrassed to explain to my grandmother, then it's just wrong. She's my favorite person, so I got to figure out a better way to say it. So that's my number 1 test. Am I hiding something? And then how would I feel if somebody else found out about it? So this is something, if you look in your handouts that also came with this, you'll find a 1-page piece of paper that I think it's attachment 1. If you just take that, cut it out, stick it in your desk drawer. It's one of those things that, one of these days you've come up with a really hard problem. It's one that you just pull it out and say, ponder it a bit. It's kind of one of those quick references. Also a good thing if you're mentoring somebody else, you can hand it off to them. Go to slide 10, please. Okay. So what are codes of ethics? You find that states where you get your license usually don't have codes of ethics. They have written into their statutes where they issue your PE license. They'll have in the statute statements that will incorporate elements of various codes, and then that serves that purpose. But the professional societies do have codes of ethics. The American Society of Civil Engineers is a pretty good code of ethics, as does NSPE, and they're actually quite similar. So I have the ASCE Code of Ethics up here, and it has these 4 fundamental principles, which I think captures for engineers, and American Society of Mechanical Engineers has something very similar. You can read through it. Engineers uphold advanced integrity, honor, and dignity. That's a good start. Talks about knowledge and skill to enhance human welfare and environment, honest and impartial, striving to increase competence and prestige, and support professional and technical societies. So it's really kind of overarching, and it talks a little bit about what was some comments were earlier today about doing the right thing and being trustworthy, and a little bit about Aristotle, about living a virtuous life. That's really what we're talking about here, being upstanding. That's what these principles are really trying to get to. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Because beyond the principles, then they have fundamental canons. And in the canons, they get into more specifics that are a little bit more, not exactly technical, but they get into, I would say, specifics that border into technical. But for Canon 1, I'd already mentioned this earlier, it talks about health, safety, and welfare of the public. This is the overarching canon that most, at least civil engineers, can almost always remember. But no, Canon 2 talks about only performing in your area of competence. And that's the one that really, if you're a civil engineer, you're expected to know a little bit about a lot of things, at least enough to refer people to other areas within civil engineering, but only you work in the area that you understand. This gets into talking about making public statements only in an objective, truthful manner. Again, protecting the profession and protecting the integrity. Acting professional matters with each employee and client as a trusted agent. I think the others, I don't need to read these to you. I think you can follow that. You can see the Code of Ethics has been around for over 100 years, and it was implemented initially back in 1914 because there was a failure, and the American Society of Civil Engineers were grudgingly instituted their first Code of Ethics to prevent government regulation from stepping in and providing some other type of oversight. Next slide, please. Last 2 codes, canons, talks about 7 talks about continuing your education, a responsibility that recognizing that knowledge continues to evolve and is our responsibility to remain current in our field. And then the last one is a new edition, came about in 2017. It talks about recognizing people based on their race, national origin, ethnicity, religion, age, and sexual orientation. So, next slide. I think we're near the end, at least of the Code of Ethics. So we've got the NSPE. I just want to give you a little different viewpoint. I'll let you look at the slides at your leisure. These are very similar to the ASCE Code of Ethics. I put that up there because it just gives you a different viewpoint. Very similar. Talks about public statements, acting as trusted agent, avoid deception, so forth. Next slide, slide 14. This one is the state of Virginia. Talks about what an actual state puts in their statute. This is law for the state in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and you can see some similarities between what a NGO, non-government organization, a professional society such as ASCE or NSPE had, and what a commonwealth or state put into law. Talks about responsibility to the public, the making of public statements, conflicts of interest, competency, professional responsibility, the use of a seal. Again, that gets back to working in your area of responsibility, and the use of the seal, actually stamping of a document and when you can stamp and what you can't, meaning you actually have actual oversight. I didn't put in all the text. I didn't think that was necessary for this presentation. What I'm really getting to is I wanted you to see the overall overarching. If you go to your state where you're licensed, you can look at the statute and find out what areas your license requires you to adhere to in terms of your ethical responsibilities. And then the various sanctions talks about those areas that have been, or individuals that have actually been sanctioned. And somebody's email's up. So for SAME. Okay. So and the okay. So this just gives you how you go about finding what your requirement is for your license. Let's go to the next slide, which will be a different state. I can't remember which one I put up next. This is Florida. Florida did not have the broken out individually like Virginia did. So it just had engineering, and then it got into business and professional regulation. You find different states do it different ways. And in the business and general provisions, it had talked about deception and just general business practices and registration and that sort of thing. The engineering was pretty broad. It didn't get into nearly the level of detail and specificity that we saw in the state of Virginia. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this gets us to some case studies. But before getting into the case studies, I just want to stop and see if there's any questions or comments. Thoughts?
The lines are now open. If anybody's got a comment or a question for Dr. Joe.
Everybody's really silent on this. Hopefully you're still awake.
Matt, there's a comment in the chat box.
And I think, yeah, the comment from John was just going back to the fairness of the society, saying that John was in agreement. He thought it was fair for the public to expect the same level of ethics and trust from within our work and without outside of it, since our personal activities are a true reflection of ourselves.
Okay. All right. Well, hearing nothing else, what I would suggest you do, you would have received this as part of the advanced package, but we can also pull it up on the screen. We have 2 case studies. We'll just look at the first one. It's case study 1027. And what I'd like for you to do is take about 3 or 4 minutes to take a look at it and see what you have to, see what your initial thoughts are about a case study. Case studies are difficult to do over a telephone line. I get that, but this is the best way to test your thinking or get your thoughts out. So take a few minutes and let's see where you are. Okay. So you lost money on this first project, asked for a bid on a second project. There are 5 suggested courses of action at the end. What do you do? Guess we could open the lines up and see if there's any suggestions.
I'll go ahead and be the first one to chime in. So I think some of this kind of relates to the client and the client type. So certainly with this being a private sector development, we do work on both sides of the house, both public and private. So when we're doing recurring work with a private sector client, we're probably more inclined to be along the lines of item 2, because we're pretty open book and honest with those folks that we're doing continual work with, and say, hey, we came up short the last one. It'd be nice if we could recoup here, but we certainly understand your perspective and take, and let's see how the development costs look overall. But certainly on other clients that we're working for, if it's more of a closed book, you gotta stick to item 1, where it's, hey, it's only what this project cost is incurring, and not looking at past historical data. I mean, doing that for your reference point on your fee proposal, but certainly putting together a fair and honest for that level of effort.
Yeah. Other people? Has anybody ever been on a job where you talk to someone talked to you, or you talk to them about increasing costs on a different part of the project to make up costs on the previous part? Just build on a different part to cover losses on a different part?
This is Zachary Payne, not necessarily the same scenario, so to speak, but we do a lot of firm fixed price type efforts where it's not a time and material basis or anything like that. And there's certainly some balancing if it's for the same client between jobs, just from our own internal billing perspective. I think that's a little different dynamic there, where I don't think to me anyway, there's no ethical issue there, because it's mostly internal accounting and it's firm fixed price. But if you're in a point where you're balancing between different jobs, time and material, I think that's certainly in a gray area you'd want to stay out of.
Yeah.
And I think the way I read the scenario was similar to what you were speaking to, Zach, a firm fixed price. But yeah, I certainly agree. When you're doing time and material, it is what it is.
Yeah. One thing it was here was just going back to him and saying that you lost money on it, that either you misbid it. I mean, I work for the government. It's pretty routine for if the bid was off, for the contractor to come back to us and claim that the bid was off. I mean, it happens to us all the time. And for whatever the reason is, they'll give us the reason. We end up usually negotiating for whatever the claim is, but that's not one of the options that was listed here. It's just interesting that wasn't listed. Other thoughts? So the ends don't justify the means, I guess, is what most people are saying. That's really what this is getting at. Do the ends justify the means? Really trying to say, do the right thing. That's what the whole story is supposed to be about. Okay. Won't belabor the point. Let's we put up the other one real quick. So you have one more, case 1028. Not that, the other case study.
Eddie, it was just pages 3 and 4 of the last PDF.
Oh, I apologize. I was not tracking. Oh, there we go.
All right, my mistake. So for everyone else, it's case 1028, a long distance operator. We'll take just a couple of minutes to look at this real fast because we're going to run out of time. Okay, so you're going to sign up for this telephone service that's going to take and track all your telephone calls and create a separate billing system. Or are you going to pass it on to your customers? Sort of like IT system. Is it fair to be passing on these extra billing services to your clients? Is basically what it's asking. Any thoughts?
It's hard to tell in the reading. Is it saying that the costs you're passing on are reimbursed to you at a later date?
Yes. That's exactly what it's saying. And that, you know, your services are being reimbursed. Your costs are being covered by the client as well. And part of the issue, we don't have a lot of time to explore it. Part of the issue is that, you know, what level of clarity is being passed on to the customer. You know, do you give full, how much disclosure are you providing them? I probably should just held it because we don't have a lot of time to discuss it. Takes a little bit to sort through with this one.
Yeah, it's
I'll tell you
kind
what.
of a tough one where my head's going, Dr. Joe, because part of my thought is, okay, what is the, you know, again, is it private sector or public? I mean, if it's allowable overhead cost and using this service is reducing the administrative costs. So if it's an allowable overhead where this function is less expensive than the man-hour time for an admin, then it's a win for everyone as it relates to a true overhead. But if it's something that's explicitly identified, I mean, I see where you're going. I think the big concern there is the transparency involved with it.
That is cutting to the chase. That is the question that's being posed. I mean, it could be, you know, they made it a little wordy there to get around to that point. What is the level of transparency that you have to provide a customer, a client, when you are putting together all of your overhead costs, regardless of what it is you're billing them, whether it's testing or in this case service charges. I mean, all the things that you bill. What level of transparency should you be providing when you're billing them? That's what they're getting to. I tell you what.
Well, I think,
why don't I leave this one for homework? Let you guys figure it out. Send me an email. Because we're right out of time.
Well, with that, Doctor, we certainly appreciate your time. I think we all took a lot away. I know we're a little bit quiet, but certainly more interactive and engaging than some of the ethic ones we've had in the past. So certainly thank you for your time, sir, and we appreciate the support of the young member community.
Not a problem. I hope somebody got something out of it. If you have any questions about any of these materials, the first handout has some references of other things. I would encourage you to take it onto yourself to hold a session at a monthly meeting or something. There's some videos that are in there that are I think very interesting. They're good for an hour session. They have some questions to go along with them. If you're looking for a video, I could probably get it for you. If you can't get one sent to you, they're really interesting and for a good face-to-face discussion. So send me an email if you have any questions.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Y'all have a great week.